Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I, as usual, am your host, Sarah, and as usual, I am very happy to be with you to bring you another author interview. This time I am speaking with author Mark Chesnut. We're speaking about a memoir. Before we do that, though, how was your weekend? Hope that you did something enjoyable. We are just plowing something our way through 2023 already. We are quickly approaching February, which is crazy, but good. My aunt is coming to visit the end of February. In just a little over a month she will be here, so I'm excited about that. As for the weekend, we had such a lazy weekend. It was so nice. Oh my goodness. We worked a lot of crazy hours last week, and the lazy weekend after the crazy week was perfect. We watched TV, we snuggled with the dogs. I can't remember if I mentioned last week that we had to take both dogs to the vet. And then, actually yesterday, I ended up taking our girl dog back to the vet because she has a cold now, on top of the issues she was having last week, but they're both doing better. And so really, just the weekend was perfect, and I definitely needed the lazy time, just hanging out with the hubby and the dogs, and not really doing much. I still, ran errands and did some productive things, but also got some downtime, so cannot complain about that. At any rate, as I mentioned, I'm speaking today with Mark Chesnut. We are talking about his memoir. It's called Prepare for Departure. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book. At an early age, award-winning travel writer Mark Chesnut learned to dodge discomfort by jumping on the nearest plane, bus, or car. That tactic proved especially useful when his single mother made it clear that there was no room for discussion about his gay identity. Mark, overwhelmed with wanderlust, shoplifts in airports, avoids Southern Baptist salvation, acts like Hillary Clinton in a nursing home, and dresses in drag with his grandfather. He even creates an imaginary airline and flies away. Now, as 89-year-old Eunice Chesnut moves to a New York City nursing home to be near her son, Mark's obsession with travel takes a back seat as he embarks on the most emotional journey of all. More than an end-of-life memoir, more than a collection of childhood memories and travel stories, Prepare for Departure showcases what happens when a permissive mother and a misfit son face death while revisiting life. Buckle your seatbelts for a witty, touching, and darkly humorous trip through time, loss, forgiveness, and acceptance. And again, that is the description of Prepare for Departure, and I did not give you the subtitle. The subtitle is Notes on a Single Mother, a Misfit Son, Inevitable Mortality, and the Enduring Allure of Frequent Flyer Miles. That is not maybe the most detailed title ever, but it is, you know me, I love details. I love, this is like the subtitle version of my kind of epilogue, right? I love a good epilogue that tells me everything that's happened to those characters down through the next 3 generations. And I love how much this subtitle tells me, making me want to, if I hadn't already read the book for this interview, it would make me want to read this book just to find out more, to fill in the blanks where those commas are, right? Notes on a Single Mother, a Misfit Son, Inevitable Mortality, and the Enduring Allure of Frequent Flyer Miles. That right there would suck me in. And this book also sucked me in because it is hilarious. It is poignant. there's so many different layers, and Mark's going to talk about those in the interview, of different entry points that people who are reading the memoir can jump into the book with. Whether you've experienced end of life issues with a parent or someone that you love, whether you felt like you were a misfit kid, whether you were raised by a single mother, whether you had a coming out experience, or there's just so many different layers, like I said, to this book, and different points of entry. So kind of whatever your experience is, there's probably going to be something in this that is going to resonate with you, and it certainly did with me. Mark is a self-identified misfit. He talks about growing up, and he was a bit of a misfit kid, but that just made him so endearing to me as a bit of a misfit myself. I want to go back in time and hug that little kid, which would be awkward for everyone. All right, who is this random middle-aged woman who has appeared out of nowhere and is hugging me, and then going back in her time machine? No, that's too awkward. But you know what? Time to turn to the interview, because I have started to ramble about time travel. So again, the book is called Prepare for Departure. The author is Mark Chesnut. Let's turn to the interview. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very happy to be speaking with you.
I'm happy to have you here and excited to talk about your memoir, Prepare for Departure. But before we do that, if you can just share a little bit about yourself before we start talking about the book, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I'm a full-time freelance travel writer, and I've been based in New York City for many years, but I'm originally from a small town in western New York State called Brockport, New York, and my family was originally from the state of Kentucky, so I spent a lot of time in that area too when I was growing up. I've been addicted to travel since a very early age, and writing has been my primary outlet for expression for just as long, for more years than I can remember. So it's really been a dream come true to have this book come out and hear the people's responses to the book, which are sometimes surprising, but always really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I bet. I just love, after reading the memoir and some of your experiences growing up, I love that you became a travel writer, and we'll talk more about why. But not everybody gets to kind of live out some of those childhood dreams.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm very lucky. It's taken work, like
Sure.
any kind of career. It does take work and some strategizing and planning, but also like everything else, it takes some luck too. So I feel very lucky and fortunate to be able to do something that I'm passionate about.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So give an overview of the memoir.
Well, the Prepare for Departure, I like to describe it as the story of a mother and son who are facing the final months of the mother's life as they revisit their lives together. And it's really kind of a multifaceted story. So it's a coming of age story. It's a coming out story. It's an end of life story. There are a lot of universal themes like that, but it also happens to be my story and my mother's story because it is a memoir about our lives together and the evolution of our relationship. So, but it's also a story about kind of following your dreams, feeling like a misfit, but finding your path in life as well, and caring for aging parents. So it deals with a lot of issues that have been resonating with people in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different layers to the story. At the beginning, when your mother first moves closer to you to go into the nursing home, you talk about how you had this image in your head of this kind of buddy road trip movie where you and your mom would reminisce and have this great experience, and that didn't happen. But in some ways, the book became that. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of kind of describing it, because it may be cliche to say life is a journey, but it is. And so while I didn't get to do that final road trip with my mother that I had kind of thought would be a wonderful mother-son experience to have, our final months together were a journey on their own, in their own right. And so it was an emotional journey, and it was a journey in different ways. But still, yeah, we did take a trip together, in the book. Overall, it just wasn't a road trip, although there are road trips and air trips and all different kinds of travel that we did together that are in the book.
Yes, and those are so fun to read about. Actually, your mom by herself just sounds like a really fun person, and then your relationship together was fun to read about and kind of experience along with you as you tell it from your perspective. So that for me, that was what I enjoyed most about the book, was just getting to know the both of you separately and together.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, I think my mother was a funny woman, and she was a smart woman. I think she was smarter than me, and she may have been funnier than me. So yeah, she was the kind of person that even if she hadn't been my mother, I think would have been fun to write, a fun character to write. Because she did have a lot of personality, a lot of character, and a sharp sense of humor. So that was one of my goals with the book, is to portray a person like that, to show her various aspects, her good sides, her more difficult sides, and a sense of humor, which for me is always important too.
Mm-hmm. And you had an interesting relationship because you're not an only child, but your sister is 13 years older. So you basically grew up as an only child. Your father died when you were very young. So it really was just you and your mom for a lot of your growing up. Can you talk a little bit about how that dynamic comes into play in terms of the relationship that you had with your mom?
Sure. And yeah, I like to say that I was raised as an only child, even though I'm not an only child. And my sister, it's not like my sister was estranged or anything. It's just that the day that I started kindergarten, she left and moved away to college. And so I know some people have vivid memories of their early childhood, but I don't. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to. But yeah, so I don't remember ever living with her when I was growing up. So she was around, but she was off, more in the distance. I didn't see her as much. So yeah, and between that and then my father dying that same year when I was 4, almost all of my childhood memories and my growing up experiences were really just my mother and me. So it really was just a 2-person household. And I think, I think there's like psychological studies about that, and the relationship is different between a parent and child, I think, when it's just one parent and one child and nobody else around. And so it's interesting. I think and I explore this in the book, how things can be different when you're an only kid with a single parent, is that, there's, for example, there's not as much of a need for set rules, for example. If you have 2 kids or 3 kids, you may have to say, okay, nobody goes into the living room after 5 p.m. or whatever kind of rule. When it's just one kid, she didn't really have to make up these set rules, because everything was kind of amorphous, which maybe, I think that informs like my personality now, where like I don't need a structure to setting because I didn't grow up with a structure to setting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I paused that in an interesting place because I was about to say, yeah, it does. And you probably hear that in there. And so when we come back from the break, it's going to pick up with that and. So put a pin in this conversation. But that does tell you that we are taking the first break of this episode. And when we come back, this conversation will continue. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Mark Chesnut. Just to remind you, before the break, he was talking about the structure with which he grew up and the relationship that he had with his mother. And I said, yes, I understood. And so this question is going to pick up with an and I told you to put a pin in that conversation. And now get ready to take the pin out as we return to the interview. And I'm thinking of one scene in the book where you are about 12 or 13 and your friend says, hey, have your mom drive us to the airport. And she does. And this is obviously pre 9/11 because you guys just wandered around the airport. But your mom was like, yeah, I'll just bring a book. I'll sit around while my kid and his friend run around the airport. Don't be gone too long.
Right. Yeah. And when people hear about that, they're like, oh my gosh, my mother never would have done that. So yeah, I think one of the reasons why it was possible was because it was just her and me. So it's not like if she did me a favor like that, she didn't have 3 other kids that she'd have to do strange favors for. It was just me. And she was very permissive and she allowed me to indulge and explore my passions and my interests, which have always been, travel and creativity. And so yeah, I was really lucky about that. And a couple of people who've read the book have actually said that in some ways like that, my mother's personality almost seemed grandmotherly. You know how people always say like their grandmothers and their grandparents really were the ones who like, kind of treated you specially or, indulged you more. So in some ways, I think that is a valid point that in some ways my mother was almost grandmotherly in terms of she would do things that a lot of parents might not be able to do for their kids or might not want to do.
Yeah. So when you think about this story and not only the relationship with your mom, but your experiences growing up and the path that you took that led you to where you are now, what was your impetus to write it as a memoir?
Well, I really didn't set out to write a book in terms of this particular story. I started writing the book, what became the book, for my own personal and psychological reasons, because in 2015, my mother was diagnosed with a brain tumor and she started to go downhill fairly quickly over the course of a year or two. And so it was really difficult to deal with for her and for me and for, other people in our family and friends. So I guess since I was already writer and had been a writer for a long time, although travel writing is my main gig, but the act of writing has always been really therapeutic for me. So writing down what my mother and I were experiencing helped me to deal with that. And then it gradually became something bigger. It became, rather than just the story of her final months of life, it expanded into to become the story of a relationship between a mother and son that spans decades, and the story of being a misfit and following your dreams and finding your place in the world. So the themes really did expand, and it gradually and organically became a book.
And it's obvious that your mother's short-term memory especially declined rapidly after she moved closer to you. But so was she really aware of you writing things down? Were you able to have many conversations with her? Her long-term memory was better. So were you able to have some conversations that helped you fill in some gaps?
Yes. Yeah. Her and you're totally correct. Her short-term memory really was gone. So I couldn't ask her what she had for lunch if I visited her in the afternoon, for example. But I could ask her, what kind of clothes she wore when she went shopping in downtown Louisville, Kentucky in 1947 or something, So I was able to converse with her and ask her some questions about long ago things that she, and, her marriage and things like that too. But she didn't know that I was writing a book. I think partially that was because I didn't really know for sure what I was doing. She did know that I was taking some notes because she was so funny, even when she was in the nursing home and not feeling well, she'd sometimes things that were so witty or clever that I would, whip out my cell phone and start jotting down notes about what she said. So, and she would be like, what are you doing? What are you writing down there? So she knew that I was taking notes, but she didn't know what it was for. But again, probably it was because I didn't know exactly why I was doing it other than to psychologically, process what was happening. Makes
sense. How about your sister? She would have also been basically raised as an only child. Have you and she ever talked about your different experiences? Her as an only child with a 2-parent family, you as an only child with a 1-parent family. Have you talked about those childhoods?
We have a little bit. Yeah. And it's kind of fascinating, really, because it was 2 very, very different experiences, even though there were some of the same people, some of the same characters involved. Yeah. Since she was born in 1951. And so her childhood was, the entire 50s and into the 60s. And it was more of like this, I guess you could say, like a stereotypical 1950s nuclear family with 2 parents, one kid, and then eventually I came along as a surprise kid much later. But she said that it was, I think it was more of a traditional, stereotypical family. And, my father was a smart man and liberal and progressive in some ways, but I think he was sexist also. And so she said that, what he said goes was the kind of the lay of the land at that point. And also she wasn't really presented with options in terms of religious beliefs or lack thereof. And so she was raised in a much more traditional household. By the time I was conscious, after age 4, and I knew what was going on, like I was just raised by this widow, but this, single widow, who was in charge of everything in her life and had taken charge of her life and gone back to college and gotten her degree. And she was, liberal and educated and super smart and was not as traditional from a religious perspective or in other perspectives also. So yeah, it's a really different, there could be a book written just about something like that, really. So two kids that are siblings, but we did have very different growing up experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really not relevant to anything except that you had more of a childhood in the 70s, and you all often describe your turtlenecks and you're either patchwork jeans or corduroy. I just have this image in my head of you as this kind of scrawny little adolescent in so many fabulous turtleneck combinations.
Yes.
If that's not true, don't disillusion me, okay?
Right. No, it is very true. I tried desperately to fit in from a fashion perspective, and it was very 1970s fashion. And and I wish, back then people didn't have cell phones, so people weren't snapping photographs as often. But I do wish there was more visual documentation of how silly I probably looked.
Well, you mentioned the Partridge Family, and I kind of have an image of you in my head as the redheaded Partridge kid, but.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, there were, and there's never been that many media representations of redheads, so yeah. I related. So he did stand out to me just for nothing other than he was a redhead too. So yeah, I mean, I kind of, the same kind of round face and red hair and and sarcastic attitude maybe too. So yeah, there's some similarities there.
Yeah. Anyway, that was a side tangent. I apologize. What did you take anything away from the experience of writing the book that maybe, or when you decided finally that you were going to write it as a memoir, did you take anything particularly away from the experience?
Well, I definitely got what I'd hoped to get from it. I found that writing the book to be really therapeutic, and I think a lot of writers find that, if you have something that's so emotional, so difficult, or so perfect, whatever it is, if you have the story in your head, and so you may not even realize it's a story, but it's therapeutic to get it out there. So it really helped me to review various aspects of my relationship with my mother and various aspects of my life, and to really, understand and appreciate my mother and both of our lives in a different way. Since I was able to step back a little bit and also have other people read my work as I was writing it too, because I was, in a writing group and in classes too. And the other big lesson that I learned myself was how much a lot of us have in common with each other as human beings, even if it's people that you might think you have nothing in common with. And that's been a really amazing and emotional surprise, because I honestly, at first, as I was putting it together, even after I decided I was going to make it into a book, I thought nobody's going to care about my personal story. I'm just like one weird guy, and, who cares? And it's not like I have the world's most incredible story to tell or so, But then, as I mentioned, I found that there's so many universal issues in the book, in my story, that a lot of us have dealt with. And so I've heard from a lot of readers and a lot of attendees at book events, people from all different backgrounds, about how they could relate to certain parts of the story and prepare for departure. And so it's really been an unexpected surprise and a great experience to feel such a connection with people who I would have thought I would have nothing in common with if you just, shown me their life stories, or given me a summary of their life stories. I would, or if I just met them, I wouldn't have thought we had anything in common, but we do.
Mm-hmm. Have you had anything that surprised you about people's reactions of the book?
One of the surprises, I guess, is that I thought, the book is funny and it's sad. If you've read it, so I think I hope you'll agree with that. And I thought that I needed to use a lot of humor, partially because I'm not Abraham Lincoln. I don't have like some fantastic biography that is like so consequential that it's worthy of world attention, maybe. So I thought like, oh, the sense of humor is what's going to carry people through the book. But what I found that's been surprising is almost everybody who does comment or contact me about it is they're more propelled forward by the sadder aspects of the story, or the misfit aspects of the story, or the following your dreams aspects. So people comment that they like the humor, but they really can relate to the difficult parts of the book, about caring for an aging parent, or dealing with the death of a parent, or, feeling left out of, when you're at school, feeling like a weirdo, like a misfit at school, or trying to find out what you want to do with your life and making that happen one way or another. So what's been a really nice surprise is to hear how many different parts of the book people are able to relate to. And meanwhile, I really did think that people would be reacting more to the humor, and they still do. And I'm glad about that. But I'm like so touched and happy that people find emotional resonance in different aspects of the book too.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm jumping in for the second break of this episode. I don't know what it was about this interview. Did I start every question with "and"? Because I keep coming to the point where it's time for a break, and I am having to pause, and then we're coming back from break with me saying "and." That's just the theme of this episode, I guess. At any rate, you are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I'm speaking today with Mark Chesnut about his memoir, Prepare for Departure. We are coming back after he was talking about things that resonated with readers of the book. And my next question is starting back into that conversation again. As I mentioned before the break, we're starting off with an "and." Let's get back to the interview. And that emotional resonance, is that something that you would hope, is that what you're hoping people might take away from the book? Or is there one specific thing that you hope people will take away from it?
It is something that I hope that they take away from it. And I guess maybe, now, if you'd asked me before the book was out, I don't know what my answer would have been. But now that I've heard from a lot of people, since the book has been out for a little while now, I think that just the emotional connection that a lot of us have in ways that we may not realize until we learn more about each other. I think that's a lesson. I've heard from people who can relate to various aspects of the story, and people who said they hear their own voice in different parts of the book. People seem to appreciate the parts of the book about growing up as a misfit, for example, and finding your passion, following your dreams, but also caring for an aging parent, losing a parent. And, things that are specific to my situation, like, for example, I thought it was really interesting. One person, my book, there's one scene in my book where I'm gay. And when my mother's in the nursing home, at one point I'm hesitant and I avoid identifying my husband by calling him my husband in front of one of the nurse's aides, because I'm afraid that what if she's homophobic and then she takes it out, she mistreats my mother and takes it out on her when I'm not around. And my mother at that point wouldn't have been able to tell me. So I don't identify Angel as my husband. And that bothered me so much. But then I heard from someone else who said she went through similar experience where she withheld things about herself, but it was because she was Jewish and she had her father in a hospital. And for whatever reason, she said she was afraid that some of the hospital staff might be anti-Semitic. And so she avoided mentioning the fact that they were Jewish. And so that's just one really specific example of how I've been so surprised and fascinated by the fact that people can relate even in ways that we may be different, but there are certain things that cross barriers and cross identities. And that's been really interesting to see.
Yeah. And there's part of me that hears those and wishes that neither of you have to censor any part of yourself in the hopes that, you or someone you love is not, there's no ill effects, but unfortunately that's the world we live in. And it's,
right.
At least it's nice when you have those connections and you can meet people in places that you both have commonality.
Right. Yeah. It's really a way of connecting. And I love, when I've done like book groups and public appearances, that's one of my favorite things is to hear other people's stories, because it's just always, it's surprising and it's touching. And the fact that we can talk and we can relate to each other on shared experiences, even if they're different in so many ways, but they are shared. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have, the world can be so divisive sometimes, but we have a lot of stuff in common too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in rural Western Montana, so my growing up experience is very different from yours. Obviously, I am, a woman, you're a man, et cetera, but, still I can find things. My father died in April of this year. And so a lot of things about talking to your mother, caring for your mother really resonated with me.
Right. Well, if I can ask you a question, because one of the things I was concerned about is, for someone, and I'm so sorry about your father, but was reading this book, was it harder to read a book like this because of the recent loss of your father, or did it just make it more relatable, or how did you react to it?
This one did not affect me as much as a few months ago. I had a woman writing about her experiences with cancer, and it was part memoir, part kind of things that you can do as a person if you have cancer or someone has cancer. My father died of mesothelioma, and she was just talking about some of her experiences and things that she found that made it easier to navigate that process. That one was really, really hard for me. This one was not as much, and I don't know if it's a few months later or if I'm in a different place mentally. This one was, I think, maybe easier because it was more about your relationship and less about, you talk about your mother's diagnosis and her care, but that's not the focus. So I think just the relational aspects made it easier for me.
Right. Yeah. Because my book is, and it goes, as it jumps back and forth in time. And so it's really about the evolution of our relationship together, from speaking from the quote unquote present at the time of the book, where it was my mother's last few months of life, but then with flashbacks to all different years and how our experiences were.
Yeah, absolutely. So I usually ask people what they are working on now. And obviously you're a travel writer, so you're probably working on various projects for that. But would you consider writing, maybe not another memoir, but writing another book of some sort?
Oh yeah, for sure. And as you guessed, I'm always working on travel writing. And so that's my main writing activity. And I also do photography, and I'm working on rebranding my travel blog. But I'm not working on another book yet, but I'm keeping my mind open and seeing what ideas might land next. And you know how it is as a writer, things kind of like have to come to you, So I'm just scanning the neighborhood in my mind, and it may be another book exploring family relationships somehow, and family history. Not exactly a memoir though, or it may be one that explores how travel affects our lives psychologically. Something that connects like the emotional levels, the emotional aspects of travel too. So I'm just not sure exactly what. So if anybody has a good idea, just let me know.
Okay, sounds good. I've nothing for you right now. In terms of writing, let's start with travel writing, I want to ask you if you have advice for people who want to write. And maybe there's somebody out there listening who has some of those aspirations that you had as a kid about travel. What would you say to someone who's thinking about maybe writing about travel or something in that genre? Is not quite the right word, but you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. Well, first, I would say it's definitely a good idea to follow your passions and your real interests. So if travel is your passion and writing is your passion, then definitely go for it. For travel writing specifically, I can describe my path. Actually, there's a chapter in my book that describes in a humorous way what my path has been to become a travel writer. But first up, you start small. Unless you have great contacts, at Travel and Leisure or the New York Times or something. Otherwise, I would say, start small. I started out by writing. I was already working in publishing, but in medical publishing. But I knew that my dream is just to be in travel writing. So I started by writing a monthly travel column for a free weekly newspaper in New York City. And they didn't pay me a cent. I just did it because I needed to, they call it clips. You need your clips out there. To show what you can do and kind of establish yourself. And so with those clips, I was able to start getting paid assignments and then eventually get a full-time job. So I would say, be ready to start small. And the main thing is, stay focused and don't ever give up. It doesn't matter how many rejections you get. That just means the timing hasn't been right and you haven't found quite the right market yet, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad writer or that you shouldn't do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. And then as someone who did not necessarily set out to write a memoir, do you have advice for someone who's possibly thinking about writing a memoir?
Yeah, that's been a fascinating experience because I'd written one book before, but like 10 years ago, that was a travel book. So it's completely different ball game. So with this, you need to do research a lot. Obviously, it's good writing. You need to write and revise and share your writing with writing groups or, with a writing class or whatever. You need input from others about your book and you need lots of revisions, no matter how great a writer you are. But also you need to research. If you're going to try to get an agent, you need to make sure you're pitching to the agents who are appropriate for the kind of book that you're writing. Because otherwise you're wasting your time and theirs and you won't get anywhere. So, and every agent does have different interests. And then after that, in my case, I was unagented. And so I went to indie publishers. But you need to be careful with that too, because every independent publisher and every big publishing house have very different areas of focus. And so you don't want to waste your time, sending out to inappropriate, publishers or agents who would have no interest in your work. And having said that, then you'll still get rejections even when you send stuff out to your proposal or your book to the places that are appropriate. And so you just need to be prepared for lots of rejections. And again, it doesn't mean anything about the quality of your work. It just means either the timing was off or they weren't looking for your thing wasn't quite a good fit for them. So you don't ever give up, really. And also the way I look at it too is, how I don't buy lottery tickets, but if you buy lottery tickets, you usually don't win, right? You might buy a lottery ticket every week, but you won't win. Most likely the odds are actually better for you getting your book accepted than for winning in the lottery, I believe. But if you don't buy the lottery ticket, you're never, ever going to win. So just keep buying those lottery tickets, keep sending your book or your proposal out there. And, celebrate every rejection, because the more proposals or the more manuscripts you send out to the more people, the greater the chance that someone will say yes. And so it's just like the lottery. You've got to be in it to win it. And so don't worry about the rejections. Celebrate the rejections because you're really putting yourself out there and you're on the road to doing something great, because you just never know exactly when it might happen.
Time for our final break for this episode. When we come back, a little bit more about this idea that Mark just mentioned about celebrating rejections, because that is definitely a positive way of looking at something that can feel very negative. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Mark Chesnut. Again, we were talking about his memoir, Prepare for Departure. As a reminder, in case you paused this and came back many hours later, or you just forgot what we were talking about before the break, because that happens to me, we were talking about advice for aspiring authors and rejections, and so we're picking up with that conversation in the next question/comment. I think you're the only person who's ever, people have talked about the rejections and, what you can learn from them, but I think you're the only person that's ever used the word celebrate. So I like that. It's a different way of looking at it.
Yeah. Because when I got it, obviously nobody wants to receive rejections, but I knew I was going to get some and I got a lot. And yeah, I just felt like I love ticking off, like I kept like a checklist, not a checklist, but just like a list where I'd tick off every time I sent out a new proposal or a proposal to, or a copy of the manuscript to someone new. And I just love they gave me a sense of satisfaction. Like every little check mark that I'm sending this out again to, or every rejection I get, that puts me closer to actually getting the book published. Even if it's a rejection, it's just like your odds are getting better and better. So yeah, celebrate it, because it means you're making an effort. Like you're supporting yourself, you're believing in yourself. So yeah, it's totally worth celebrating.
Well, and when I think about it, at least you're getting a response, right? You're not just sending it out there into the ether. There's often some good constructive things that come with rejections.
That's true. And I have gotten some non-responses, which are worse. But the one good thing about those is that I sent out to so many different publishers that the ones who didn't respond, I probably didn't even notice. So it didn't get me too down. But yeah, you're absolutely right about some rejections can be very, very constructive. So I got some great rejection letters from a couple agents and a couple book publishers that said, no, thank you. But then they said what they really liked about the book, or they might've said, we really love this aspect of it, but we're thinking maybe you need to position it more like this, that kind of thing. So they were briefly written rejections, but they were so constructive that they really did help me to better pitch it in the future. So yeah, people who reject can sometimes be really, really helpful. It's true. Yeah, absolutely. So when you take the time to read for yourself, do you have favorite authors and genres that you turn to? Yes. And especially during the course, since I first started writing down my experiences with my mother, I was drawn to other memoirs and also to humor. And so during the writing process, reading other writers in similar genres to what you write or want to write in, it can be a huge help. So I've become a big fan of David Sedaris, of Samantha Irby, and Jenny Lawson, because I think they all have really distinct voices, and they also know how to use humor brilliantly to deal with sometimes difficult topics. I also like nonfiction because I'm always trying to learn something new about the world out there. And also I really like, for example, this is another memoir though, Crying at H Mart, which I thought was a beautifully done book about a woman who's dealing with the illness and departure of her own mother. So yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of voices out there, but those are some of my favorites.
Do you have particular favorites that you like to read on like an international flight?
It really varies. I mean, you know how it is. Sometimes you're in the mood for something like light and, or like suspense or whatever, something kind of silly, but other times you want something that's a little heavier. So it depends on what time the flight is, I guess, and how tired I am. But right now I'm reading, let me just see, like on my Kindle, I have, what is the book about vitamins or something? I'm reading it. Goodbye Vitamin, which is a novel that's kind of heavy topics about a sick father. And so it's kind of memoirish. It's kind of similar to my stories. I'm still obviously drawn to stories that are kind of similar to my own. But I'm gradually going to start getting out of that. I was just reading part of a book about like the biography of Cruella de Vil too, just to balance it out.
Oh, interesting. So, but you've got a Kindle, so you can mood read. You don't have to pack 20 books.
Exactly. Yeah. And it took me I don't know how it was for you, but at first I hated the idea of Kindle and ebooks and everything. Yep. You know, it feels so good to hold the book, but when you're traveling, or even if you're just at the grocery and like the line is longer than expected, yes, to be able to, you always have a book with you. And that's a really, really wonderful thing. I still have some hard copy books too, but I always have one or two Kindle books just because you never know when you might need some reading material, right?
Yes, I pretty much, if I'm standing in a line, I am reading.
Right. There's always every minute that you're waiting for something else is a chance to read or to learn something new or to explore more, and also to scroll through Instagram, of course.
Well, of course, yes. In terms of speaking of Instagram, in terms of your internet presence, if you can share a website and any social media that people can find you on.
Sure. My Instagram is Mundera, and that's spelled M like Mary, Undera, Mundera. And then on Twitter, I'm Mundera Media, spelled the same way. But as like the one-stop shop for everything, all of my writing and the book and my other writing too, you can go to my website, which is markchesnut.com. And that's Mark with the K. And the big thing to notice is that Chesnut has no T in the middle. So it's not quite spelled like the nut itself. So it's MarkChesnut. And there I've got everything that I publish in magazines and stuff is there, as well as lots of information about my book too.
Do people ever spell your name right?
Very, very infrequently. And I always point it out when people are like making flight reservations for me or whatever, if I don't make my reservations directly, but it still comes out wrong. Yeah. More than half of the time. So it's just my, it's the, my lot in life is to be forever correcting spelling my last name. I guess, I don't know. I think maybe my ancestors were illiterate and that's how the T fell out of the middle.
Or you can make up a good story about that anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
They sold the tea for something. I don't know what.
I like it. We've talked about a variety of different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to make sure you highlight?
Well, I guess I would just say that writing is something that's always been a part of me. And I think if the people who are listening to a wonderful podcast like this, it's probably a part of you for a long time too. And it's a really natural form of expression for people like us. So, writing and reading are so powerful. So, I would just, I just want to like end on like a positive note of support for writers and readers out there. Because when you get your writing out there, whether it's in a literary journal, on a website, or in a book, you have a really unique chance to share your message and to connect with people in ways that you may not have thought possible. And that's something, a big lesson I learned from having my book, Prepare for Departure, be released. So if you love writing, keep at it like I did, never give up. If you just love reading, then thank you so much for supporting independent authors and publishers. Like my book is published by an indie publisher. And so I think it's a wonderful community of writers and readers that we have here on this planet. And it's easier than ever for us to follow each other and to keep in touch, thanks to social media and technology. So let's keep the creativity going.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And thank you also for taking the time to talk to me about the memoir and your mom and just so many different things. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks for the great questions and for having me on.
Thank you once again to Mark for joining me to talk about this memoir, to talk about his childhood, his relationship with his mother, how both of those things, of course, impacted who he became and is as an adult. As I said at the beginning, there are multiple points of entry for a reader for this book. If you're a fan of memoirs, if you like to read parent-child relationship memoirs, if you had an awkward childhood, if you are part of the LGBTQIA plus community and that relationship with a parent and how that all worked for you, you might want to read this. If you have a love of travel, if you've ever thought about being a travel writer, I mean, there's so many different angles or different ways of coming at this, but there's also just the point that it's a memoir. It's funny, it's poignant, it is sad, it will make you laugh, it will make you roll your eyes at times about some of the things that Mark's mom says in certain circumstances, and it's just, I really, really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed getting to know Mark and his mother, even though I have never met, and I never will meet his mother, and I've never met Mark. Getting to know Mark, and a little bit even Mark's husband and his sister, but just getting that glimpse into someone else's life and seeing the ways that it mirrors or reflects my own life, or what I can take from someone else's experiences that make me view my own in maybe a different way. And so that's really what I took from this memoir and just enjoyed so much. And it made me reflect. We talked a little bit about my dad's passing in April. It did make me reflect on things that I think about with my dad and that make me smile, or maybe that have affected who I am as an adult. So that for me is a gift always. It's still the first year. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. I can't believe it's here almost already. But and so I'm always thinking of him. But to have this kind of opportunity for a more focused thinking, if that makes sense, or maybe not opportunity, but just to be able to read this book, to read someone else's experiences with a parent, and then to reflect on my own, that was lovely. So thank you to Mark on a personal level for my experience with this memoir. And thank you to him on a professional level for joining me for the podcast. As I said, if you are a fan of memoirs, you should definitely check this one out and get to know Mark and his mom and his family a little bit. I hope you're having a great week so far, as always. I hope that you will join me for the next episode, where I will be speaking with author Coco Picard about her novel, The Healing Circle. So join me for that, hopefully. And as always, if you are a fan of this podcast and could help me out, it would be awesome. If you have not done so already, please like, subscribe, follow on whatever podcast platform you listen on. That way you will know when every new episode comes out, even when they come out twice in a week, which they sometimes do. And I believe next week we're having 2 episodes in a week, 2 interviews in a week. So should be a Tuesday and a Friday next week. But if you like, subscribe, follow, you will get those notifications, and you will know without me even having to tell you. Also, if you could leave a review, written or starred, just like you do for your favorite authors to help get those books out. Written or starred review really helps get this podcast out to other listeners. And also follow on social media. Love hearing from you, hearing what you're reading, etc. You can follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Thank you so much. I hope you are having a wonderful week. I hope your Tuesday is going well. But as always, I hope your day, your week, your life affords you plenty of opportunities to get yourself lost in many, many, many good books. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.